So what's meant by merge priority? This is where things get really tricky and really creative by some mailers and some service providers. This is where nefarious things happen in an area that's supposed to be fair. Some folks rig the merge, stack the deck, and put lists in an unfair position, sometimes because they've got a lower list cost, sometimes they have a long-standing relationship. Whatever the reason is, they will play around with merge priority. But I'm going to go first through what a traditional merge-purge priority looks like. So you're going to have to kind of visualize this. Imagine a big Excel spreadsheet with the numbers 1 through 100 on the left-hand side. And then the next column is every single list selection that I have going into the merge. So that usually starts with my, again, back to the sharper image, my 30-day hotline names. That would be probably highest priority in the merge. And it'll go all the way down till I get to like 48 month, 3-time buyers, 50 plus. And that might be ID number 60. That's how many selections are just in the house file selection alone. And then from 61 through 100, say I'm mailing 40 different prospect lists, I'll have each one of the lists that I'm mailing assigned to that ID. So what happens is on lists 1 through 60, as a mailer, I would send the service bureau instructions to say, for lists IDs 1 through 60, I want the number 1 ID to be in highest priority, and I want the number 60 list to be in lowest priority in that tier. So call that priority 1. In priority 1, I want to make sure that I'm always assigning my oldest house file records to the most recent transaction that they've had, just so I keep the efficacy of how I mail my customer file. So that's highest priority. There's no debate typically about what that should look like. And then they might create a second tier, my 60 plus month names or whatever from Sharper Image, things I would absolutely not mail. I might put that in just as another list. Kind of treat it as a prospect, but it's still in higher priority than anything on the prospect list. Again, to match rental lists back up to those older selections to mail them as a super dupe. And then sometimes they put in a suppression file. So we experience this with a number of clients. They typically don't apply that big suppression file to their customer records. They usually do that somewhere else in the merge or somewhere before they do the selections, but they can do it in the merge. You're going to hear that. It depends a lot. But they might bring in a suppression file. This might be the 2 prior mail files, the 2 prior campaigns. They don't want to mail a rental list for whatever reason that they just mailed in the past 60 days, past 90 days, or whatever it is. So they might bring in those mail files as a suppression file. That has lower priority than the house file and higher priority than the rentals below it. And then multi-buyers are really tricky. When I was talking about the creation of all those multis coming from 3 different lists, some mailers will put that full bulk. They'll say, I want all of my 2-time plus multis that came out of the last job. I'm going to put it in priority over all the rental lists. Well, that is a bad strategy. I can go through probably an entire hour explaining why that's a really, really bad strategy. But it really kills the performance of any list, particularly co-ops, since we're so multi-buyer driven, when you put a multi-buyer list in priority over the rental files. So those are the various merge priorities. And then we get into the rental lists again. They're not prioritized by ID, call it tier 3, tier 4, wherever we are by now, and say for those lists that are rental lists, they should be random by ID. So that's typically what my merge instructions would look like. I might have 3 tiers of different types of priorities in the merge. And those are the instructions that I would send to the service provider. Okay, this is how I want you to run the merge. And then sometimes, and very seldom, best practices is to put those multi-buyers in the very, very bottom of the merge and call it a tag file. So what that does is that keeps the integrity of that multi-buyer pool. So I still have the right to mail them. And I can still mail them. It's just that if a record is in a 2-time plus multi-pool down at the bottom and appears on a rental list, the rental list will get credit for it and they'll mail it. And now they still have the ability to mail that record 2 times more. They don't lose that information. And any records that are left over that don't hit the rental files, they can mail it in that campaign. That's a nice advantage of a tag file. That, in my opinion, is best practices. I would say Less than 5% of our clients do that. And I would say that there's a fair amount of clients that put multi-buyers in higher priority in the merge over the rental list, which I think is like, it's fairly unethical and it just hurts the performance of the campaign. A great example of this is, we've lived this with Serena and Lily. And, they started to mail big time through COVID and created these ginormous multi-pools, and they put them in merge priority. And coming out of their best seasons, that multi-pool could be 10 million, 15 million, 20 million records, and no list survives that. And so what's left over from the rental lists are the records that survive, that are unique to the multi-buyer pool, still have to go through random allocation across the other rental lists. And so the chances of those records of working are pretty slim. And so this is probably the biggest question that I ask the account managers to follow up on, is to find out if they're putting multi-buyers in priority or some other file like a suppression file in priority over the rental list, because you can usually see that in the nets in terms of how many names we sent versus how many names actually got mailed. But you'll definitely see a degradation of performance as that multi-pool increases over time, if it's in priority in the merge. So a little more, rental lists are generally run in random priority. We talked about that. There's this one mailer out there called Vermont Country Store, and they run a merge called Racked and Stacked. And they have their own reasons for this, and they've never shared with me what those reasons are. But what they do is they do everything else that we just talked about, but they put each one of their rental files, and particularly the co-ops, in a prioritized manner over the next one. So if they're mailing Epsilon and they have a long relationship with Epsilon, they know how it works, and then they mail Wyland and they mail everything that they can from there, Wyland is second to Epsilon in that merge, meaning any record that Epsilon provides with their co-op or any other rental list gets assigned to Epsilon, which is a huge advantage. A huge advantage. Those are best performing names, records that are coming from multiple list sources. Their methodology is to say any new list that I want to mail has to be incremental to what I've been doing for years. So therefore it goes in lowest priority in the merge. So the chances of a new list working for the Vermont Country Store has always been super hard, right? Unless you're able to break through and find ways that nobody else is doing out there in the co-ops, it's certainly hard to find a brand new set of names for them to mail to survive the merge. That's racked and stacked. I call it that. I think it's pretty well known. That's how people call it. It's not an official term. And we talked a little bit about tag files. We don't see it very often. And when you do, the broker report will tell you most of everything you need to know. If we sent out 100,000 records and we got 20,000 records allocated to us, you can pretty well bet there's something weird going on in the merge. It doesn't happen a lot, but when it does happen, man, it's really hard to make your names work.
In the nonprofit space, the rental lists, right, that's kind of all encompassing. Those are co-ops and exchanges. And they almost always put exchanges in priority over the rented co-op list. And I just wanted to ask whether or not that was normal in the catalog side, or if that's really more of a normal thing for nonprofits specifically.
Yeah, it's a really good question. That's another thing. I started off by saying people will do creative things in the merge. What they're trying to do is on an exchange, there's usually an exchange fee, anywhere from $5 a thousand to $8 a thousand. So it's a really low list cost. And so they're basically penalizing any of the lists that they're renting and taking a net against those exchange names. So they're saying, okay, I'm going to mail all of my competitive or all of my exchange files. I'm going to put those in higher priority because I've got a really, really stupidly low list cost associated with them. I'm going to put all my higher cost lists, my rental lists, my co-op lists in lower priority, just so I can save a few bucks on the rental. And what happens obviously is you're doing that at the detriment of performance of those rental names. And it really doesn't save you much money. And it's actually, can't really say unethical. It's taking a net against, so I provide 100,000 records and you're going to take a net against exchange names. You can take a net against house file records. You can't take a net against exchange names. And again, I'd say I took a hard line on this for a very, very long time and eventually just got overwhelmed with people don't care. They're looking to save pennies on the dollar, and they're less concerned about the overall performance of what's going to happen with those lists that happen underneath than they are about saving those few pennies. Is it happen a lot in catalog? No. Catalog list selections have become, as I said, the sharper image. It was not unusual for me to mail 100 different rental lists at Christmas time for the sharper image catalog. And a lot of those were exchanges. You generate a ton of multis, all the rest of that stuff. And you had to be very careful, even as the sharper image, to take those multis forward into the next campaign and just mail them outright. I generated a ton of multis and I bring them into the next campaign, and then I bring in rental lists. If I brought them in underneath the multi-pool, nothing would work. Nothing would work. Not only that, the records that I could mail at the sharper image, I've talked to the data science team about this. The types of lists that I could use were very different in Christmas time than they were in spring. The folks that were buying during Christmas were largely female. It was 80% female purchase activity during Christmas time. In the spring, it was mostly men, and those multis that I created in Christmas didn't work in springtime campaigns. So long-winded answers to basically say, I don't think the catalogers really do that. What Sharper Image used to do is mail 100 lists. Now the list selections are maybe 3 co-ops and a handful of outside lists, mostly on exchange.
And I know Brian's talking about the multis going, people putting them in the merge and using them, but I'm also finding that on a lot of the, like these newer agencies, kind of like SQL and Share Local and some of the more newer, they don't use multis. They actually throw them away, which Paul asked me that question this morning, why there was no multis in my results. And I said, these guys don't use them. So we still see it a lot on the catalog side that they're using multis. They're typically having us suppress them prior to running our models. But on the other verticals, in terms of like these, non-participating and direct-to-consumer verticals, they don't actually even use the multis, which is interesting strategy. So just wanted to share some of that.
Ran a roll-up sports team catalog. So there were catalogs out there that specifically targeted soccer moms or baseball or football or whatever it was, and they had all of those catalogs under one roof. And I met with the CEO and the general manager, and they said, we don't want to mail anybody more than one time, ever. And I was like, but you're going to run out of names to mail, and when you're generating a 1% response rate and you have really good prospects out there, I'd rather mail a really good prospect that shows up on multiple lists than one that shows up once every 3 years. It was just crazy. I told them that was a bad strategy. They ended up going out of business, not necessarily because of that, but that was a big reason. Their mail performances went right through the floor. This was a thing that happened to Williams-Sonoma many, many moons ago, is their best source of prospect names were their own lists. So Pottery Barn got cross-sold to Williams-Sonoma, that got cross-sold to West Elm. And so they would do what was called a mega merge. And they would bring every rental list in for each one of the titles and all of their house file records and make selections out of that. Well, the Williams-Sonoma files got so big that hardly any rental lists ever survived the merge. And that's a big reason why Williams-Sonoma walked away from doing rental lists, is they would rather rely on cross-selling in their retail files than try to mail outside prospect names.